Many amateur chess players have the illusion that the ending is boring, or that the ending is something that's very prosaic and not, and it's just like something like eating your spinach of a chess player. But this is not really the case. And if you really want to be a great player or to improve, you need to put a lot of effort into the ending and to appreciate the ending and the beauty that positions that are relatively simple contain. The first example I'll start with is an example of a study, or an etude, as they're known in the chess world. And these are not something that you hear about a lot, but it's something that you can benefit from. You can gain a lot of aesthetic appreciation from, but also you can learn how the pieces interact and actually benefit a lot in terms of improving your chess. So this example is a study by a composer named KnyitvsBishopImbalancebyBryanSmith4. I'm not sure what year it was composed. In any case, it's white to play here, and you might come to this position and see the 2 extra knights, which certainly are something, and you see that white also has a pawn, but quickly you notice the pawn on g3, which is very hard for the white king, impossible for the white king to catch, very far from the white king. And you start looking at the knights, and we know from the knight versus bishop chapter that knights are not good at stopping past pawns. And in fact, these knights cannot stop that pawn with normal moves. But luckily, white has some abnormal moves here to save the game in a rather magical way. If you like, you can pause the video and try to figure it out for yourself, but it's a little bit difficult. The solution is to start with the move h6, an absurd-looking move that throws away the pawn, but draws the black king into a future knight check. Now, this clearly should be one of your candidate moves once you realize the knights are just too far away. Black has to take this pawn, because if he pushes his own pawn, white will also queen, and then clearly black will not be winning the game. So he takes the pawn, and now white needs to come closer with his knights. And now white needs to come closer with his knights. It's only an intricate analysis can determine which knight and how. But as it turns out, knight b to d6 is the way to do it. We need the other knight going to the e7 square, as we'll soon see. So now black, well, he has to push his pawn, otherwise white can catch it. White's threatening already knight f5 to win the pawn, and he also plans to, for instance, if black plays king to g5, well, he can play knight e4 in this case, and king h5 could be met by knight f5, so trying to dodge the knight's checks, and then after this, suddenly white has this check, followed by knight e2. We'll see that variation in a moment. So black plays g2. Pawn's one step away from queening. How can white stop it? It seems impossible. White plays knight f5, and now black needs to step carefully. If he goes king g6, then comes knight h4. Well, this is obvious enough. White takes the pawn, and of course with 2 knights against the king, it's a draw. If black plays king g5, then there's another trick with a fork, knight d4. And if the pawn queens, then comes knight f3, again winning the queen back and being left with 2 knights against the king, again a draw. If black plays king h5, we've already seen that. White goes knight g3, followed by knight e2. And once the knight controls the square in front of the pawn, and white's king is far away, even if the white king is far away, it can't be chased away from the pawn. For instance, king f3, knight g1, king f2, knight h3, king g3, knight, and so on, knight g1, and you can never chase it away. Only if the pawn were an h pawn could it be chased away. If the knight were on h1 and the black pawn on h2, black could play king f3 and then king g2, but that's not the case here. So clearly black is left only with one possibility, and that's king h7. Well, his king is far away. There are no checks. We know the relation of this knight and this king. The knight is not going to check the king anytime soon. Looks like black's about to queen the pawn, and normally a queen will defeat two knights, especially when they're so widely separated. But in fact, white plays this move, knight c to e7. Black can't do anything. Moving the king is obviously pointless. So he queens the pawn. And now the next move is also very important. King b4, white has to play in order to avoid having his king squeezed into the corner. And the game is a positional draw. The two knights protect each other with just absolute total unity. They cannot be attacked, either one of them. They both protect each other. This is something really only knights can do. And they lock the black king in a cage. We notice that these squares are controlled by the knights, all of these squares. So while the black king could move back and forth between h8 and h7, he cannot get out of this cage, which means the queen is left on her own to confront the white king and somehow checkmate him, which will, if you know that you king and queen against king checkmate, you know it needs the king in order to do it. And here black doesn't have the king. So the only hope he had was if white didn't play king b4, for instance, if he played king b3, black could squeeze the king into the corner, forcing him into a stalemate position, and force one of the white knights to move away. And then once the knights are no longer linked, because of zugzwang, the knight will have to move away. For instance, queen c5, white would have to move his king. If king to b2, then queen c4 would follow. Because white has no moves with his knights, they can't lose a move. Queen b3, white king is stalemated, but it's not actual stalemate. White has to move a knight. Wherever he moves a knight, it's going to be forked one way or another. For instance, knight c6, black would play queen a4 and take the knight, and with queen against only one knight, obviously win. Same if the other move, for instance, knight to d6, queen a3, on a wide open board with unguarded pieces, one of them is going to fall. But at this position, that's why it's so important that white play king to b4. Now there's no way for black to force that stalemate type of position. For instance, if queen c1, white can just go up the board. He can also, I think, go to b3, but in any case, if he goes up the board, he can't be squeezed in this corner because the knights control key squares. For instance, king b8, queen cannot go to c6. So there's no way to force the position. The king will come across this way, and again, there's no way to get him. He also can't, black can't, after king b4, if he could somehow bring the white queen into the white king into the h1 corner, he can't do that either because the knight covers g3. So there's no way. He can only give checks or wait, but there's no way that he can break the link of the two knights, put white in zugzwang, or free his king in any other way. So it's a positional draw. In our next segment of Endgame Magic, we'll see a very beautiful endgame played by Aaron Nimzowitsch with the black pieces against a player named Walter Henneberger from a tournament in Winterthur 1931. It's black to play, and we see this position on the board, and it doesn't take a whole lot of positional understanding to realize that black is better. Clearly we have a very standard good knight versus atrocious bishop position, and not only that, black has more space. So the question is not who stands better here. Nobody would really doubt that. The question is, can black actually win the game? And it's amazing, but it's quite difficult because white has almost a complete fortress. Black needs exceptionally subtle play in order to win this game. So first of all, what move could black play here? Only king or knight retreats. If he plays a3, white just waits with his king, and the pawn on a3 could become a problem that white could attack later with his bishop. So black needs to start with some kind of maneuver to give the move to white here. He wants it to be white's move in this position, because right now the bishop is guarding the weak pawns on g3 and c3. If we imagine it's white's move, he has to make some kind of concession. He either has to move his king back, or he has to push his pawn to a3, which is awful because then the knight comes to b5 and will win a pawn on a3. White won't be able to defend all of his weaknesses. So black begin with a triangulation. King d6. White's bishop can't move because he'll lose his g3 or c3 pawn if it moves. a3 is very bad. So he has to retreat his king. And this is how triangulation works now. Black king doesn't go back to d5, because then the white king would just go back to e3, and all we would have is a repetition of position. But instead, black plays king c6, staying in touch with the d5 square from a different square. White, because of his restriction of his space, his spatial disadvantage, he needs to be able to go back to e3, but he can only do it from e2. So if he were to move his king back further to f1 or d1, then king d5, and it would be even worse for white. So he goes king e3, and now comes king d5, and black has achieved the goal. He's given the move to white. This is only the first act of this endgame, though. White is forced to play king e2, but the game is not over. If he had played a3 just now as before, a simple win would be knight d6, bishop d2, knight b5. Pawn is lost because if bishop c1, knight c3. So white can't play a3, he plays king e2. Black has achieved the goal of making the white king move back, but it's still not over, because now black wants to invade with the king on e4, but the knight's occupying that square. So the knight has to move out, knight d6. And king e4, if this is achieved, would be decisive. So white has to stop him with king e3. If he tried bishop d2, then black, for instance, he gets his king to e4, and we see how this gain of space with the king here is absolutely decisive. Now the white king can't move because it would allow the black king into one of these two light squares. White has to play knight c1 or bishop c1, knight to b5, bishop d2. If bishop b2, then comes a3, and the bishop would be relegated to this square, and this is hopeless for white. For instance, knight c7, and now a black king will invade, and also the knight will go to d5, and the black king will come to either f3 or d3. But if white tries bishop d2 back again, then the knight comes in this way. So the black king on e4, the knight can just start hopping around. Bishop e1, knight b1. Now again, the king cannot give way. King f2 allows king d3. So white loses a c3 pawn. He either has to play king f2, allowing king d3, or drop the pawn bishop f2, or play bishop d2, in which case there's a trade of pieces, and then the black king comes in and takes the g3 pawn. So clearly there was no allowing the king to e4, but white doesn't have to. He plays king e3. Next comes in the next act. The knight jumps in and strands itself. This is the only way to make progress. Knight e4 would just repeat the position. There's nowhere else the knight can go where it achieves anything. The bishop can always defend the weaknesses. For instance, if the knight goes to h5, white will just move his bishop back and forth. So knight goes to b5. White has to play bishop d2, protecting the pawn on c3 without keeping the pawn protected without moving his king. And now the knight comes into a3. Now there's no threat, but once again white's in zugzwang. If bishop e1, this allows a fatal trade of minor pieces, knight c2 and knight e1. Just as we've seen in the knight versus bishop chapter, when you have a minor piece that is better than your opponent's, a strong bishop versus a bad knight, or a strong knight versus a bad bishop, sometimes you have to exchange off your opponent's weak piece in order to make progress. And this is in fact one of the advantages of having the stronger piece. So in this case, black does indeed exchange off the bishop in order to invade with the king. And after king e2, the position would be a draw if the black pawn were already on a3. But black has the move a3, a spare move, forcing the white king to give way. And black will take either the c3 or the g3 pawn. So that move is not possible. So white had to play bishop c1. He still couldn't let the black king to e4. Now comes knight to b1. Rather than turning back, the knight strands itself. Bishop to b2. The only way to guard the pawn without allowing the same exchange of minor pieces. Bishop d2, knight takes d2, so he goes here. a3, and now bishop to a1. White has to play this move. If he goes bishop c1, black would take the pawn on c3. Now both knight and bishop are trapped. The white king can take the knight, but the problem for black is that it's his move. He would like it again to be white's move. The white king would have to move back. Then the black king would come in. So once again, the same triangulation. King d6, king e2, king c6. And now if king e3, king d5, and white king has to give way. So he prefers to do it right away, because here, of course, black is ahead in time. For now, if he goes king f2, then king e4 would be met by king e2, and white would still be barring the way, but black now, after this move, can bring his knight out. And then black is just winning, for instance, if the king moves, knight b3. Threatening the knight, and if white takes, it pawn takes, and then the pawn queens. So since he can't bar the black king's entrance, in this position, white decided instead to just go get the knight right away and begin a race. The knight is trapped, but the black king is going to take the g3 pawn. So king d5, king c2, king e4, king b1, king f3. Now it seems like it's over. Black's just going to take this pawn, and queen is g-pawn. The white king can't stop it, and the bishop clearly is trapped on a1. But it's not over, and I think Nimzowitsch had to take into account from the beginning white's next move, bishop b2. So the bishop is selling its life in order to create a passed a pawn. If black doesn't take the bishop, white will take on a3, and the bishop breaks free, and then he can probably find some way, for instance, by bishop c5 and d5 to stop the g-pawn while his own a-pawn is going to advance. So after bishop b2, black took a4. White clearly has to advance the pawn as quickly as possible. Black takes on g3, a5, and here Nimzowitsch played the accurate move. There's a race of pawns. You would think he would take the f4 pawn, because what difference does it make where his king is? He gets a free pawn this way, and his pawn is the same amount of time. But Nimzowitsch instead played king h2. Why would he do that? Well, we'll see in a moment. White played a6, black played g3, a7, g2, a8, and black queens with check, a key detail. Without that move, without it being check, it would be a draw. And after king takes b2, which is white's only move, then comes queen g2, and here we see the purpose behind the clever king h2. Had he taken on f4, he would have a king on f4 and an extra pawn, but he wouldn't be able to trade queens with queen to g2. So he'd have a queen and pawn ending with an extra pawn. It would be a lot more work at the very least. So after queen g2, forces yet another king and pawn ending. A second endgame, you might say. And now there are equal pawns, but the black king is better positioned. And once again, we have another race, because both kings are going to take pawns. King a3, white has to go after the c4 pawn. Black goes after the f4 pawn. King b4, king f4, king c4. Black played king e4. And now comes the final act of this drama. King b4, freeing the c-pawn. No other move would do any better. Black pushes his pawn, and both sides advance. Finally, black queens first, winning by a single tempo after all of that. c7, and now comes queen a6, and white resigned. The pawn is stopped, and white is down a queen. In the next example, we'll see a fragment of a game from the famous Hastings 1895 tournament. This was a last round game, and the fairly unknown player, Harry Nelson Pillsbury from the US, was leading the tournament. But the tournament had kind of a photo finish, and his nearest pursuer, Mikhail Shigorn, had won his game in this round, while Pillsbury's game was looking quite quiet and maybe drawish for a while against a player named Gunsberg. And they reached this position. Pillsbury knew at this point that he had to win the game if he wanted clear first in the tournament. And luckily for him, he found a magical breakthrough here, which became a famous part of chess literature. Well, it seems like there's not much going on here. While both players have a bunch of pawns and one knight, you could say white has an advantage because he has this passed pawn, protected passed pawn, but it's well blockaded. And when black plays knight c6, it appears there won't be any kind of breakthrough for white. Now is the time to strike, it turns out. And Pillsbury found a way first to undermine black's pawn chain, e6 and d5. And this required deep calculation, otherwise he could even run the risk of losing. He played the move f5. So he's trying to separate the d5 pawn. So if, for instance, black takes on f5, then white takes back. And if g takes f5, then comes knight f4, and black can't defend this pawn. White would win the pawn and have two connected passed pawns, while black has these terrible doubled pawns. So this would be a decisive advantage for white. If black plays g5, on the other hand, then the knight would come the other direction. This would stop knight f4, but it would allow knight to b4. And again, white wins the pawn. So after f5, with the move knight f4 also looming after, for instance, knight c6, white would have knight f4. And again, this pawn chain is under decisive pressure. Black had to stop the knight from getting to f4, and he played g5. What's white going to do? Taking on e6 is fine, but how is white going to break through in this position? Black will play knight c6, a5, and there's nowhere on the board for white to break through. So now is the time that he needed to continue forcefully if he wants to achieve anything here. Knight to b4, fighting for the square in front of the pawn. This is a very committal move because now black can just play a5 and chase the knight away. If the knight just retreats, then knight c6, and again, black is absolutely fine. He's not going to lose the game. He shouldn't, at least. So here's where Pillsbury started this combination which has become famous and which won him the tournament. Played c6. And this took an enormous calculation because he's actually running a risk now. If he lost, then Chigorin would get clear first. Well, it's clear that if black takes the knight, then c7 creates a double threat of queening the pawn as well as taking the knight and queening the pawn. This is a problem with knights sometimes also in dealing with pawns. If the knight didn't exist, black would have king d7 stopping the pawn. But because the knight exists, black's own piece is a problem for him and allows white to win. So he couldn't take the knight. Black had to stop the pawn, but he has an easy move, king d6, stopping the pawn, and it seems like white is miscalculated. Knight is under attack, it's being undermined, the pawn will be captured, and white will be down a pawn. But Pillsbury, of course, took this into account. He took on e6. Now if black takes the knight, these two pawns will defeat the black king and knight. First, the deflecting move e7, threatening to queen the pawn. Black has to take it, and then c7, with once again the same double threat. Again, if black didn't have a knight, king d7 would stop the pawn, but he does, so white wins. So after f takes e6, black also can't take the pawn because, again, c7 will win, so black has to simply capture the pawn on c6. And no doubt Gunsberg was very happy to remove this dangerous passed pawn, and it looks like there is no problem now. White knight is under attack. White trades the knights, otherwise he just loses the pawn on e6, and clearly the black king is in the square of white's pawn. The pawn was easily stopped by the black king. This would have been a loss for Pillsbury if he didn't have the next move planned in advance. He needs to somehow support this pawn. Well, his king can't do it, so his pawn does. e4. He's ready to take on d5. Black takes the pawn on e4 now, otherwise white takes on d5 anyway. So for instance, if b4, white takes on d5. So he played d takes e4, now d5, king d6. Black again is stopping the pawns. He can't take on d5 because e7, but he's stopped the pawns. He has a potential passed pawn on the queen side because of his majority, and he has this passed pawn as well. And on the king side, he can even create a passed pawn, as we'll see. Who will be first? Will black manage to create pawns on both sides of the board and eventually win, or will white somehow get there first? Pillsbury's calculation had to continue from the very start, at least from the move c6. Well, he has to first take care of black's pawn on e4, king e3. Black plays b4, he has to advance his passed pawns, create a passed pawn. King takes e4, a4. And now comes the king back with king d4, getting in the square of black's pawn. Now black has a number of possibilities. And he actually, unfortunately, didn't play in the most resilient way. And he didn't allow Pillsbury to show how deep his calculations were. He played h5, which lost in a routine way, and then we'll see the finish of the game and then come back to what Gunsberg could have played. After h5, white took on h5, and now he's ready with king c4 to start taking black's pawns. If b3, white would just take it, and if black played a3, the king would stop that pawn, and if black starts to advance his f pawn, the problem is that white's h pawn is much, much faster, just queens far before. And so instead of b3, black played a3, hoping to be able to play b3 next move without allowing the white king to c3. Typical pattern, but if he can stop the pawns with king c4. Queenside pawns are going nowhere. It's a race between the f pawn and the h pawn, but that's very close, and black resigned now. That was pretty simple, but black had some I think black calculated the other lines and realized they lost, which is why he, in desperation, played h5. He could first try the obvious move b3, but this would be fairly easy for white. White would take, and then a3. If he took with the pawn on b3, the pawn wouldn't be very far away, and white would easily stop the pawn. Creating a passed pawn on the king side is too slow. For instance, like this. White king just... white just plays f6, and he gets there first. For instance, f7, threatening to queen the pawn. Black has to stop it, and then d6. And white's pawns break through first. For instance, king f8, d7. Once again, threatening to queen the pawn, and then the king can't cover both squares at once. Okay. So black could try a3. More... well, the pawn's further away at least. It doesn't matter that white has the b pawn. King c3, and then play f5. h5 would still lose as in the game. If the king moves, white could play b4 and start advancing his b pawn. Black plays f5, but again, the same kind of thing would happen. f6, f7, and white clearly gets there first, just as before. Instead of either of those moves, black had a very subtle move though. King e7. This move plans to play f5 and anticipates what we just saw. The king covers the f6 square, so black gains a tempo. This forces white to show his hand, and well, the only thing white can do now is go with his king to the queen side to take the pawns. And now black advances. White has to take, and now a3. Of course, a takes b3, king takes b3, and again, it's just as before. White will here bring his king up because black has gained a tempo with king e7, but white's gained a tempo with his king. And the king comes up d6, and once again, as before, white is first. For instance, g3, f7. So best chance for black is to keep the pawn as far away as possible. Now white has to stop that pawn. King c3 is the only way. And here black has to make a passed pawn on the king side. There's nothing else to do. White intends to play b4 and just advance his pawn up the board. So he plays f5. G takes f5. And now he starts to push on the king side, h5, or g4 doesn't make a difference. Now starts a new race, b4. White can't stop these far-flung passed pawns. He can't take this pawn and get back to the king side, so white's pawns advance, b4. The black king, meanwhile, is holding back all three of white's pawns. g4. Black makes his own pawn, passed pawn, b5, h4, b6. And here, the theme is that both players want their pawns to queen with check. So the most resilient move for black is to first draw the white king to the back rank by advancing this pawn. If he didn't do it, white would also win. In any case, this pawn on a3 isn't going to queen, and white king is not in position, whether he's on c3 or on a1, to stop black's kingside pawns. So after a2, king b2, a1, king takes, g3, takes, takes, and we reach this position. Black's pawn is 2 steps away from queening. And queening with check. White has 4 pawns, but there it looks like black's going to queen with check. But here, white has the move d6, drawing the black king into a check when the white pawn queens. So this is very important. If he played b7, black could play g2, and then if he queened his pawn, black would queen. And even though white has 3 extra pawns, black actually can start giving checks to the white king, and the game is a draw, in fact. He starts giving perpetual check and eventually takes a pawn with check and then a second pawn afterwards, and the last pawn falls. So much better is to first try to deflect the king into the path of the new queen. So if black takes, then comes b7, and white will queen with check if a g2. So black has to stop that pawn, and then white uses the same stratagem as black used, queening the pawn, diverting the king to the back rank, and then a final e7, g2, and white queens with check, and wins the game. Likewise, if after d6 black plays king f6, white also plays d7, again threatening to queen the pawn with check, king e7, f6, king d8, f7, and white also wins here. So this just majestic endgame with these races of pawns and all these subtleties of sacrificing pawns to queen with check is what made this game so famous, and an example of endgame magic that every player has to know. In this chapter, I'm going to show a couple of classic games that I think you'll find very fascinating if you haven't seen them before. First, we'll see a game by probably my favorite player, Alexander Alekhine. His name is actually pronounced Aljochin, but Alekhine is what most people recognize, so we'll say it that way. This was his game as black against Richard Reti from Baden-Baden, 1925. Reti, who was a real innovator in chess, was one of the so-called hypermoderns who used the strategy of controlling the center from the side rather than occupying it with pawns, which was a real new idea at this time when most people played e4 or d4, and they were responded to usually by e5 or d5. Reti began the move with g3. So he prepares to fianchetto his bishop. Now, not the most common opening, but quite a reasonable opening that's played and is not really controversial. At the time, it was highly unusual, well, at least reasonably unusual. And Alekhine responded with e5, and now Reti continued with actually quite unusual move now, knight f3 even. Essentially, this is like an Alekhine's defense, e4, knight f6, but with an extra move g3, which could be beneficial for white, but not always. In this game, he got a good position. Alekhine continued aggressively with e4, knight to d4, and now d5. It might make sense to go for, with the move g3 included, to go for kind of two-pawn attack, c4, or c5 rather. It would be c4 if the colors were reversed, and then knight here, and something like bishop c5, and then if white has to play e3, well, this g3 move is doubtful. So that was a way to actually exploit white's extra tempo, which calls some into question. I think Alekhine actually was the one who pointed this out later. But in this game, after knight d4, he played the natural move d5. And white played d3, undermining the center. And here black, unlike in the reverse color position, can't play the same way. If knight f6 and he tries to maintain the pawn on e4, I mean, he can try to, but it would be quite risky. White has an extra tempo, and the move, the fianchetto of the king bishop, in other words g6, with the reverse colors, is one of the most popular plans in the main variation. In this case, white would have an extra tempo because he has the white pieces. So Alekhine played in a more modest way, taking on d3. But I can't say that this opening is a real success for him. After queen takes d3, knight f6, but Alekhine was not a weak player, and he was not going to go for some kind of adventure here. He just is concerned with castling and playing, even if white has some pressure on the queen side, it will be a tough game, as we'll see. Bishop g2, bishop to b4 check. A little bit of an odd move, but reasonable. Bishop e7 might have been more natural. Alekhine doesn't oppose the exchange of the dark squared bishops after bishop to d2. White could also have played c3, in which case probably the bishop would have had to go to somewhere, maybe even to e7 anyway, and this was something for white to consider, because usually he's going to play c4 later, and might end up just being the same thing without, but he decides to use his extra opportunity to force the exchange of dark squared bishops, and black now castled. And here white played c4. So he already has quite a good game. His bishop is exerting pressure along the queen side, on the long diagonal. And now he's undermining black's center with c4. And he has all of his pieces out. Alekhine has one thing going for him though, and this right now is the e-file. He has some, what's called span control there. He can use the e-file. He has more space there, in other words, and in general he can build up a little bit of counterplay on the king side, which we'll be seeing Alekhine made the most of. So again, he's going to develop his pieces. He played knight a6. He needs to develop quickly, and some move like c5 is the type of move maybe you could find weaker players playing here. But this would be too aggressive and would expose black's position further. Knight to b3, for instance, and these pawns are under pressure. And if white exchanges this one, well, then, okay, you can trade queens, or maybe queen c4, probably best queen takes d8 and knight c4. And here, this c5 move has only weakened black very severely. And black's basically lost here. So instead, Alekhine plays knight a6, c takes d5, knight to b4, queen c4, knight b takes d5. So he's recovered his pawn and brought his knight to d5. White continued with knight 2 to b3, linking his knights. He's delayed castling slightly, but he'll castle in the next move. And now c6, and white castled. So far, nothing special. Reddy has played a good opening, rather innovative opening, and he's got a good position. But black is in the game. Alekhine played rook e8, developing his rook to this open file, which is not just a routine move, but he uses this later in a quite spectacular way. White played rook f to d1, building pressure on the d file. He's going to bring his rooks to the d and c files. And here black played bishop g4. This is how black can get a little counterplay. He's got some pressure on e2. His bishop is well placed. White could play h3, but this weakens his king side a little bit. And g4 would weaken it even more. So there's no point in trying to drive the bishop away. It's actually a significant weakness, the h3 move. And Alekhine takes some time to actually induce the same weakness later on. So white played rook to d2. Just protecting his e2 point, which will be necessary at some point. Now queen to c8, a nice little move from Alekhine that takes the queen off of the d file, and also there are some other plans associated with this move. So it almost looks like, well, Reddy got probably everything he could dream of from this opening, but Alekhine is always in the game, and he's just absorbing the pressure and always looking for his own play, which he's going to find in a moment. White played knight to c5. He's got significant pressure on the queen side. He's going to eventually now start to weaken this pawn chain as well and try to use his bishop. The knight is pressuring b7. His pieces look quite active. Now black plays bishop h3, trying to remove the defender of the white king, which Reddy doesn't want to allow. If he allows the exchange of these bishops, black is always going to have some counterplay. Black will trade and then maybe queen to g4. If white can lets him, something like this, maybe queen to g4, and then knight f4 is coming, and also the advance of the h-pawn has happened in the game. So he wants to keep this bishop, which is not only a good defender of the king, but also gives a lot of pressure on the long diagonal. White played bishop f3. An absolutely natural move. Anchoring the bishop here, leaving black's bishop on h3, protecting the e2 pawn. And here Alekhine played bishop g4, again offering the same trade, and white went back to g2. And Alekhine played bishop h3, posing white a difficult question. White played again bishop f3, Alekhine played bishop g4, and if white played bishop g2, there would be a third repetition, and I think even in these days it was considered a draw. There was a point when it was 5 repetitions, but in any case, clearly Alekhine is offering his opponent a draw. But Reddy, considering he has the better position, and with some justification, decides to continue, although I think he was a little bit, well, we'll see that it was not quite so simple for white to keep control of this position. He played bishop h1. This way black can no longer offer the exchange of bishops. But it has the big downside that it blocks the king's a square for the king on h1. And the bishop is, well, it's in the way, actually, and this is a significant factor. How does black continue here? It looks like, well, there's no way in on the king side, and white has the initiative on the queen side. His plan is simple, rook to c1 and b4 to b5. Alekhine plays now h5. While leaving his pieces where they are, impeding white as much as possible, annoying white as much as possible, he simply advances his h-pawn to try to create some weaknesses on the white king side, and he's ready for the future. The white king will be a little bit more open. White plays b4. His knights can't break through on the queen side all by themselves, so he needs a pawn break. So he plays this move, which is called the minority attack. Black has 3 pawns on the queen side, white has 2. But white is the one with the pressure there in this situation. He uses his minority of pawns to attack the queenside pawns in open lines. b5 is going to make black decide either white's going to take and open the b file and weaken c6, or black will take, in which case also the b file is open and d5 is undermined. So black played a6. Actually a rather far-sighted move. As we'll see, he ends up being happy that the A file is open, and I believe he was realized that he understood that this was important. White played rook c1. Also, it slows white down because a4 is not threatening b5 yet. So the rook moved off the c file, off the a file, h4, and now a4. White intends b5. Both sides are pursuing their strategy on opposite sides of the board. It looks like black has no way through, though. He took on h3 and white took on g3 and white took on g3. And now queen to c7. Another subtle move setting up a tactic that comes in a moment. The queen is putting pressure on g3. Well, why g3? Well, the pawn is protecting solidly from f2. But Alekhine has an idea. b5. White pushes on the queen side, carries out his plan. Black took, white took. What do you play here? White's planning to take on c6. There will be a very weak pawn there on c6. White, at least black, will be suffering. He can't take on b5 really because his whole position's undermined. His knight then is not sufficiently defended. White might even be threatening to take on b7 and take on c6 with the pawn opening an attack on the knight on d5. Alekhine doesn't think about defense. He finds a counterattack here with a spectacular move, rook e3. This position is now very famous. What's he planning? Well, he wants to take on g3 first of all. If white takes the takes the rook rather, then comes queen takes g3. And it's mate following. For instance, bishop g2, knight takes e3, and there's no way to sufficiently guard the bishop. Or if white plays king f1, then bishop h3 also quickly leads to checkmate. Actually, knight takes e3 rather is immediately checkmate. So he can't take the rook. Black is planning to take the pawn on g3 with the same variations as we just saw. White has to somehow deal with that. It seems like not much. It seems easy to deal with, but it's not so easy, is it? White played now knight f3, which is a natural move, blocking the attack on g3. And it turns out that this, though, allows black to start a forced and a little bit surprising sequence of moves that lead to a winning position, and black just begins sort of a hurricane that sweeps all the pieces off the board. It's hard to believe that this quite natural move, and it's tough to choose between bishop f3 and knight f3, but knight f3 looks very natural, not consenting to the same exchange of bishops that black was already trying to achieve a while ago. It seems very natural, but this move loses the game for white. He had to play bishop f3, after which things are quite complicated, and well, I won't go into it in detail here. There's been a lot of analysis of this. White should have played that, but black is still okay. White played knight f3. What does black play here? The rook has been blocked out. Eventually, white's going to be threatening the rook, and he's still planning all the same things with b takes c6 and so on. But here, black takes on b5, and a little bit surprising move, abandoning his pawn chain, a move that white was probably not expecting a move before, but suddenly, for tactical reasons, the white queen is drawn into a square where it's attacked. He has to take the pawn back. And now comes knight c3, attacking the queen and the pawn on e2. And the pawn on e2, of course, will also fork the king and rook. So for instance, well, here white took on b7. A rather desperate move, but tricky as well, because black's rook is still hanging on e3. If he tried queen c4, b5 would have finally driven the white queen away from guarding the e2 pawn. So for instance, queen b4, knight takes e2, and white is losing. So he took on b7. The queens were traded. Even though the queens are off the board, black's play is still of a middle game nature. The white king is the object, and also white's various hanging pieces. Knight takes e2 check. White played king h2. Okay, white's rook is hanging, but already black's rook was hanging for several moves, so it's no tragedy for white. If he played king f1 instead, black would have a nice variation to win here. Knight takes g3, a desperado move. This knight is given away for a pawn, but black's going to take the knight on g3, on f3 rather. White takes on g3, bishop takes f3. White has to take because of king f2. Black can just play knight g4, protecting the rook and checking the king. If he takes, rook takes, king g2. And in principle, 2 pawns against 1 on the same side of the board, if there are rooks on the board, is a single pair of rooks, it's a total draw. 2 pair of rooks, it should also be a draw. Even with the knights, as this, it could be a draw. But here, it's not going to be 2 against 1. It's going to be 2 against 0 because Alekhine has the move rook a to a3. And the pawn can't be defended. White can try rook d8, king h7, rook h1, king g6, rook h3, guarding the pawn. But then comes rook f to b7, or b3 rather, attacking the knight on b7, and also threatening to simply steamroll the king with rook b2 and rook a1, or vice versa. This knight on b7 being out of play and also exposed is a theme that later reoccurs, as we'll see. So white played king h2, and it looks like white's surviving. For instance, if black takes the rook on c1, white takes on e3, and it's 2 pawns against 2 on the king side, probably a draw. If black plays rook takes f3, then trying to give away his rook, and only then to take white's rook on c1, but here white can remove the knight with rook takes e2. And after rook takes g3, it's going to be that's 2 pawns against 1, and white should hold the draw. For instance, king takes, bishop e2. And black has nothing special here, and with precise play, he has very good chances to draw. What does black do? Well, Alekhine was not doing either of those. Instead, he threw more wood on the fire with another, and this other jumping in move, knight e4, attacking yet another piece and creating just a dizzying situation for white to deal with. Both of his rooks are under attack, while black's rook is also under attack. Let's see what white could do. He played rook c4, saving his rook and leaving the black rook on e3 stuck, and also guarding the knight on e4, forcing the trade of rooks. Otherwise, if white took on e3, black would take on d2, also trade of rooks, but now white has two pieces hanging, the rook here and the knight here. If white takes on d2, then black takes the rook on c1 with the extra exchange, and he should win this game easily. The extra exchange on one side of the board, also rook a2 is coming. With all the pawns on one side of the board, black still wins. There's enough pieces on the board for white has no chance of a fortress. So white played rook c4. Now came knight takes f2. Rather than taking on d2, which would have allowed white to for instance, take on d2, leaving the bishop under attack as well as the rook. The rook is now attacking c4. Instead, black took on f2, continuing to annihilate the white position. Now the knight on f3 is kind of attacked, and white's also, but most of all, black's planning to take the bishop and then take the knight on f3. So here white played bishop g2. Well, black's up a pawn. Two against one on one side of the board. Should be winning. He has the aggressive pieces because it's very difficult for white to defend, but if white could manage to drive the black pieces back, make a few exchanges, he could hold the draw. So black has to be very accurate. And Alekhine continued without pause with his attack. Bishop e6, attacking the rook on c4 and clearing g4 for the knight. White played rook c to c2, saving his rook and counterattacking these knights. Now came knight to g4, and white had to play king h3, stepping into discovered check by the bishop. If king h1, then rook a1 would have been decisive. White would have to start throwing away pieces on the first rank. So he had to play king h3, and now Alekhine found a final combination. Knight e5 check, king h2, and here, if he takes on f3 with the knight, it's just a trade of pieces. White takes back, and after rook takes, then white takes here. And that doesn't achieve black's goal. But Alekhine plays rook takes f3. Winning a piece, forcing white to take back. If he takes on e2, well, he took on e2. If he takes with the bishop, then comes knight takes, king g2, and knight takes d2, rook takes d2, and here black is up a piece. So that's simple. But white took on e2, now the black rook is under attack, and the knight on e5. But now came knight g4 again, king h3 again, white has to play. Again, if king h1, then rook a1. And we see how important it was that black has played a6 and opened the a file. King h3, and now comes the finale, knight e3, another discovered check, king h2. Still, the rook is hanging on f3, the knight is hanging on e3, but the final conclusion was knight takes c2, bishop takes f3, knight d4. It's still equal except for black's extra pawn, but white will not stay with an equal number of pieces. The rook and bishop are both under attack. After rook f2, same would be the result after rook e3. Black takes on f3, rook takes f3, and bishop d5 with a perfect geometric position, forking the rook on f3 and the knight on b7. There's no way to guard both because if rook b3, the rook is still under attack there. White loses at least a piece, and therefore he resigned. So this has been one of the most famous games, a classic combination. It was just amazing how both players' pieces are constantly under attack, but Alekhine found his way through the complications and found this simple but perfect position with bishop d5 at the end. In our second classic game, we'll be seeing a fantastic game that was played in Lodz in 1907. White was Georg Rotlevi and black was Akiba Rubinstein. This was a really magical game that started off quite in a quite placid way. White began with d4. Rubinstein played d5. Rotlevi played knight f3, e6, e3, c5, c4. This is, and after knight c6, knight c3, this is a Tarrasch defense, and black, or rather white, has also played e3 symmetrically rather than taking on d5 and playing g3, which is a more critical way of playing, but the move order didn't allow him to do this. We have a symmetrical position, there's tension in the center, but it's going to be cleared out eventually one way or another. Question is who's going to take first? Will white take on d5 and black take back, and then eventually it will be an isolated queen pawn for black, or black could do the same thing, c takes d4. And white will probably take with the pawn, and then eventually white would have the isolated queen pawn. Or perhaps one of the players will take on c5. Here white made, I think, already a little bit of an inaccuracy. He played d takes c5, which you usually try to wait until your opponent's bishop has moved before you take this pawn like that. For instance, wait until black has played bishop d6, and only then white takes. And then when black takes back, the bishop will have moved twice to get to the same square. So by taking on c5, white sort of, as it were, loses a tempo. He has the problem, of course, it's his move. So if he plays bishop d3, black would take on c4 and win a tempo in the same way. So white could play a3 here, black could play a6, and the tempo battle continues. Usually, though, white at some point plays c takes d5 and goes in for this kind of position, and then maybe bishop b5 or bishop e2. But he took on c5, which makes things easy for black. The bishop immediately develops, and black is already ready to castle. And white has the problem that if he moves his light squared bishop, then black will take c4, and he'll already have gained a tempo, and it will be as if black is playing white. So white didn't want to do that. He played a3. And this is typical for these structures. Both players play this, and then black plays a6, because both players are going to want to play b4 at some point, and b5 for black after the capture on c4. White, in fact, did play b4 right away, bishop d6, and now bishop b2. Of course, taking the pawn on d5 is winning the pawn is not possible, because in the end black would play bishop b4 check with the white queen on d5, so that the pawn is not under attack. White could have taken on d5, or he could do it the next move. He did bishop b2 first, which is very natural, bringing the bishop to this square. Black castled, and here white played queen to d2, which is a second inaccuracy. The queen is exposed on d2 and can't stay on this square. It's understandable that white was loath to play bishop d3, after which black would take c4 and play b5, and then play bishop b7, and after white castles, well, it's black's move and all the pieces are the same. It ends up being even worse than that by trying to avoid it. White could have played that way, in which case it would be as if he's playing black, not the worst thing in the world. Or he could have taken on d5 and played against the isolated queen pawn after bishop e2, for instance. But either one would be better than queen d2. He's hoping to make black take on c4 with the pawn and then achieve the same development, bishop takes c4, as black did in one move. But because black has already castled and has his bishop out, he's able to play queen e7. His queen is on a good square. The e-file is going to stay closed, so there's no danger that the queen will come under attack, whereas white's queen on d2 will eventually have to move. So finally white gave in and played bishop d3. C takes d5 still wasn't good, because white's too far behind in development to start grabbing pawns in such a way. Black will take, and then rook d8, and there's too many threats. White played bishop d3, realizing, well, he just has to get castled and just eat this tempo loss. Black took on c4. Bishop takes c4, b5, bishop d3, and now rook d8. And the white queen has to move away. She feels uncomfortable facing black's rook and clearly will not be able to stay there, so white played queen e2. And now bishop b7, and white castled. So the end result of the opening fencing is that normally white has an extra move because white moves first, and in a symmetrical position normally it's white's move. But here it's black's move, and not only that, black also has the useful move rook to d8. The rook belongs on the open files. Most likely the rooks are going to go to c8 and d8. In any case, the rook is clearly better on d8 than it is on f8. So black is actually up 2 tempi. He has a free move rook to d8, and it's his move. And logically, this means that black should start an attack. And Rubinstein did exactly that by playing the move knight e5. These structures were very common in the old days. You don't see these types of positions so often now, but in early 20th century, there were many games with this structure. And this was a concept that was well known at the time. The player who gets this move in, knight e5, or if it was white to play knight e4, has some initiative because he removes the knight from f3, which is guarding the king side, and frees up his position. The knight on c6 is actually kind of in the way. The bishop is now free. This knight is better than the one on c6. And so this move was very logical, and black, of course, threatens to take white's bishop, so white has to remove the knight, and now bishop takes. So he's removed the kingside defender, and he's traded off his probably worst piece, the knight on c6. The bishops are now aiming at the white kingside, and here white broke a fundamental rule that you don't attack from an inferior position. And he tried to do so. He played f4, pushing the bishop back, but exposing white's position along the diagonals, also with the next move, weakening his position as well. It would have been better to try to slowly neutralize black's slight initiative with rook f to d1, for instance, rook a to c8, rook a to c1, and try to start trading rooks. Black would keep a pretty decent initiative, for instance, bishop to b8 is possible, and now the queen can go to c7 or d6 in some cases, and there's also ideas even h5 and knight g4 can be played, but it would have been at least a reasonable game for white. Instead, white played f4, obstinately trying to fight back in a direct way. Bishop to c7, and now e4. If he doesn't play this move, then black could himself play e5 and expose white's weaknesses on the e-file, although it was better for white to avoid e4. But this was the logical follow-up. He hopes to advance his pawns, and then after chasing the knight from f6, blot out black's bishop and exchange it off with bishop e4 and have space advantage, bring his rooks to the center, and white will be okay. In fact, if he had about 5 or 6 free tempi, he might be more than okay, but you're not going to get those 5 or 6 free tempi. Rubinstein just quietly brought his rook in with rook a to c8. There are many other possible tempting moves, but great players use all of their pieces, and before beginning to attack, they finish their development, and normally we use all their pieces, and this rook is destined to play a very important role, in fact. Here white played e5, continuing his aggressive strategy of trying to counterattack rather than trying to soak up black's pressure. Well, it's quite difficult at this point. He has weaknesses and black has a lot of pressure, but he could have tried some other moves. But he plays e5, hoping the black knight will move away, and then white gets bishop e4 and challenges the long diagonal. Here's where black, though, starts a forcing attack. Bishop b6 check, king h1, and now knight g4. And from this point on, white loses control of the game. It's no longer in his hands. At this point, his main threat is queen h4, which will threaten mate and will be unstoppable because of the pin on the g-pawn. So h3 will be met by queen takes h3. So queen h4 is a big threat. even knight takes h2 is a threat. So white had only really one try, which was bishop e4, to try to neutralize the bishop and oppose black's bishop from b7. If he took the knight with queen takes g4, then rook takes d3 would follow, and it may not seem immediately like so much, but this bishop is so much stronger, so strong that white can just give up here. Black is already threatening to take on c3, winning 2 pieces for a rook, when he'll have these 2 strong bishops against a white rook, which is hopeless. Black also threatens rook to d2, which will be a dual threat against the bishop on b2 and the pawn on g2. There's no defense to these 2 threats. So white played bishop e4, hoping to neutralize the bishop from b7. If black now pauses here, white might achieve his goals of at least holding on. There are several good moves, but Rubinstein's was the best. He played queen h4, threatening mate on h2. And white, I'm going to start over again the plane. From queen h4. So now Rubinstein played queen h4, immediately threatening mate on h2. And there's only 2 defenses that are reasonable, h3 or g3. White chose g3. I'm not going to go into h3 at the moment because it's more or less very similar to how the game went. And it would sort of ruin the suspense. I'll come back to h3 afterwards for your information at the end of the whole game. But white played g3, attacking the black queen. He hopes to drive the queen away. Queen has to guard the knight on g4. Meanwhile, the bishop on b7 is guarded. Is under attack, rather. It seems like black is miscalculated, but of course, Rubinstein had the rest of the game planned out. He now took on c3. Rather than moving the queen, he removes the defender of the bishop. He puts another piece under attack. So already bishop was under attack, queen was under attack, now the rook is under attack as well. But white has a problem because if he just first of all takes on c3, then comes bishop takes e4, and the white queen is overworked, guarding e4 and h2. Simultaneously, he can't do that. After queen takes e4, queen takes h2 with checkmate. So that clearly doesn't work. White ended up taking the queen in the game. If he took on b7, trying to get rid of this terrible bishop on b7, then would come rook takes g3. Black has only won a pawn here, but the game's also decided because white has no defense against rook h3. There's no way for him to hold his position together. Also, knight takes h2 is threatened, and if rook f3, then black could take on f3, followed by knight f2, for instance. So instead, after rook takes c3, white took the queen. What does black do here? He's down a queen. Clearly his pieces are attacking white, but white also is attacking most of black's pieces. Bishop is hanging, the rook is hanging, the knight is hanging. What's the plan? If bishop takes e4, the queen takes back, and there's nothing. But Rubinstein had seen the next spectacular move, rook to d2. Down a whole queen now, he puts another piece under attack. All of his pieces except the bishop on b6 are now hanging, but there's no way out for white at this point. Queen is under attack. White definitely has to take something. Let's look at some ways that he could play. He took on d2, going for as much, well, have to take something here. If he took, let's start with bishop takes c3, then there is a forced mate with bishop takes e4. Queen takes c4, rook h2 checkmate. Rook f3 doesn't help because black wouldn't take the rook, and same rook h2 checkmate. Bishop c3 is out. Bishop takes b7, removing that bishop, which has been a source of so many of his problems, doesn't help either. After rook takes e2, black is threatening mate on h2, and there's no good defense because the bishop on b6 is covering g1. White can play bishop g2, but then comes a final blow. This bishop has to stay here, so black can play rook h3. And mate is unstoppable on h2. If white takes the rook, then it's also rook takes h2 checkmate. If queen takes g4, saving the queen and winning a piece, then black plays bishop takes g2, and the bishops are cutting white's position apart. For instance, if rook to f3, at the minimum black can take it and he'll be up a rook, of course. He can also play rook takes f3, even better, with mate coming soon afterwards, rook f1 double check. So white took the rook. Also, if he does nothing, then black will either take with the bishop on e4 and then mate on h2 if the queen recaptures, or he'll just take the queen. So he took the rook on d2, then came bishop takes e4. The queen was deflected away from this, guarding this bishop. And queen to g2, the only way out. If rook to f3, then black can just take on f3. So he plays queen to g2. And now the final blow, where black's smaller army defeats the larger one, rook h3. And white resigned since mate on h2 is unstoppable. If queen takes e4, for instance, then rook takes h2. Rook f3 doesn't slow it down, and there's no other way to stop it. Maybe bishop d4, but then black just takes on d4, and the same threats follow. So this was a game that fascinated me, and not only me, of course, many chess players have. This is something that if you're getting into chess, this game is a classic game that you really have to know.